and welcome to the PhD Life Coach podcast. And this week I have another special guest with me. This week I am joined by Jess Dineen, who is the CEO and founder of NeuroNatives. So hi, Jess.
Hi, Vicky. Great to be here. Great to be on the podcast today.
I'm so excited to have you here. Why don't we start off as usual, people, just tell people a little bit about who you are and what NeuroNatives even is.
Sure. So NeuroNatives is a consultancy training company to raise awareness and make workplaces more neuro-inclusive. The whole idea of the business is very much to back what we're saying with science, so really using journal articles, research papers to support what we're talking about, and also backing it with lived experience as well. So I myself, late diagnosed autistic and ADHD. And so a lot of what I talk about is based on my lived experience and also kind of clients' experience as well.
Yeah. And what do you aim to do with the organisation?
The aim eventually is to run tailored consultancy. So starting off, right at the top, kind of strategy, getting workplace companies being neuro-inclusive, so thinking about their long-term vision, their hiring policies, everything from recruitment to retention to then how you're managing your team, thinking about your workplace policies, and then down to individual manager training. So how to get the most out of your employees and support them. Because the stats are there, the more inclusive your workplace is, the more productive your workplace is, and the higher retention rates. So that's the aim. And also alongside that, we hope to offer more coaching as well. We're quite a small business and we're right at the beginning of the journey. So taking very much a tailored approach and not just not a tick box exercise to make real change for neurodivergent individuals.
For sure. Yeah. And why does that feel so important for you right now?
I think being late diagnosed myself and the amount of kind of effort that I had to go to advocate for myself, and even at the start of the journey, getting diagnosis, getting the forms done, but then also in the workplace, what I needed when I asked for adjustments, to go from working 5 days in the office to 2 days in the office. I cried because acknowledging that I needed that support and that was okay. I don't want other people to have to take all that time to figure that stuff out. I want to be able to it already be in place. And I think also the amount of stress employees have who are neurodivergent around, advocating themselves, having these conversations, knowing where to start. It should already be happening at recruitment or even hiring stage, these conversations as to how to work with me or, what best practice looks like. So divergent individuals are often already tired just by living life. So to have to advocate for themselves and then advocate for themselves in work is just another layer of complexity and stress, especially if you're autistic. From my personal experience, the kind of social nuances and how you perform or how you're masking at work is another barrier, I guess. So I'm trying to remove barriers, I guess, is my long and short of it.
Perfect. And as you know, but just for the listeners, we are going to mostly focus on autism today. So I know you have expertise across both autism and ADHD, but we've had an episode with Dr. Alex Connor on before. So we've talked about ADHD quite a bit. And because of my own proclivities, it tends to come up quite regularly throughout the episodes. But I wanted to really get somebody in who has expertise in autism specifically.
Sure. Yeah.
Obviously, everything you talk about will apply to both, and don't feel like you can't talk about ADHD stuff, but I'm really excited to have somebody with specific expertise and experience in autism to talk about it.
Yeah.
So maybe let's start there, actually. For people who are less familiar, what actually is autism?
So autism, it depends which lens we look through. So you might look through the medical model. So if you go to the DSM, so the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, a word I hate, is very much called a neurodevelopmental condition. So usually diagnosed in childhood, hence neurodevelopmental, so during the developmental period. And it's where, so this is all kind of the clinical terms, not necessarily reflecting my opinion, how it should be viewed, but where someone might have challenges, significant challenges in social interaction, communication, and that could be also difficulties in communication skills, social behaviours that significantly impair daily functioning. And they do vary from one person to the next. So they might have kind of special interests or all sorts of different things. There's different areas in which it can be diagnosed, but often it looks and presents differently between males and females, and a lot of women are being diagnosed later due to a kind of broadening of the criteria, but also more visibility of what it looks like in women. And the word kind of deficit disorder is something that I do not agree with. I'm very much against the medical model. But as if you wanted to look for kind of a diagnosis, that is what you would find in the kind of clinical literature.
And how would you prefer to define it?
I definitely would prefer to define it as kind of differences in communication styles, differences in social interactions and behaviours. I wouldn't say I am deficit. I would just think I'm maybe more, for me personally, more direct, more assertive. I hate small talk. I do it because I know that that's what I'm supposed to do, but I don't like it. I think it's also remiss not to say that everyone is unique. So all autistic individuals are different. So you might find someone like myself who, reasonably social and can have a conversation and make eye contact, but it does tire me out. So I guess older kind of literature would say I'm high functioning, and then the older literature might also say someone's low functioning if they're not able to do those things. I think I'm just functioning. You don't see me on the days where I'm not talking and I'm burnt out and I don't leave my bed. So I think I definitely have challenges, but I would say there are more differences in communication styles. And some people love my approach and love my style.
Perfect. And I know you work across a whole range of different companies and organizations, but thinking specifically about academia, I know you're doing a PhD yourself. What
Yeah.
challenges do you see autistic people having when doing PhDs and in academia more generally?
I'm actually in my second year of doing a PhD now, so I think I've managed to see a bit of what I've experienced and then others around me and those I've worked with. And I think the kind of number one challenge is communication and expectations. I think in academia, we have all sorts of tools. We have email, we have Teams or Zoom, whichever the university uses. And I think it's really good at the beginning to start off with, what communication style does your supervisor like? Is it an email? Is it a Teams message or a Teams meeting? Is it a face-to-face meeting? And what are the expectations? I think challenges that I've come across is what are the expectations in terms of communication? What is their role? And some supervisors may be very clear and some may not be. And so I've had to learn the hard way as to what is expected of me and what methods work for my supervisors. But I think also in academia, there's quite a lot of unwritten rules and unwritten kind of structure and hierarchy that is not necessarily apparent to autistic individuals, especially, for someone like myself, it's very easy to make those mistakes. So I think it's being aware of those. And if you're able to ask someone in the team or if you're able to get that awareness, that's really important. So that's one. I think second is, again, expectations, but more in a kind of deadlines, what's expected of you by when, and agreements is what that looks like. Sudden changes or sudden asked to do a presentation or something really unexpectedly or things like that are very uncomfortable, very, very stressful for those, in my experience, who have autism. So knowing what the semester looks like, knowing, if you're on a scholarship, what you're teaching, having advance notice of when you're teaching it, what content you're teaching, and not getting it, like 3 days beforehand.
I was really interested in you talking about the sort of unwritten rules.
Yeah.
And I think some of the stuff around how seriously to take particular comments I've
Yeah.
seen people with autism struggle with in academia, where
Yeah.
supervisors make a sort of slightly throwaway comment about, oh, it might be good to add that analysis or whatever.
Yes.
And I mean, to be honest, it's confusing for all students when that happens.
I agree.
But if you particularly struggle with sort of the unwritten side of things, as it were,
Yeah,
then figuring out, does that mean I should do it? Was that an idea? Was that an order? Was that a suggestion? What did they mean by that? I've certainly seen people come unstuck with that sort of thing where, and you can tell me whether this is something that's accurate or just sort of what I've seen with my clients, but I see that my clients with autism tend to fall on the side of taking it as an actual instruction and definitely doing it.
Yeah, that's a really great point.
Rather than did they mean that? I don't know, kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one thing that I've learned from that is thinking about having a summary of what was discussed in the meeting and what are the action points. So then you can kind of nail down like what, the supervisor said this, did they actually mean that? Because they have to sign that form and get it back to the senior team, whatever. So a challenge would be, like you said, it's taking what they're saying as gospel or literally and doing a lot of work and actually that wasn't needed or what wasn't the case. I remember back when I did my master's, me and my supervisor, and we had to publish the paper actually, but she'd asked me to go and look at some journals that might be suitable. So I went away and did a table, the impact factor, the name of the journal, the submission, like how it all worked, maybe the referencing style. And I think she just lent a cursory glance, but I had gone and done an Excel table. And when we had our next meeting, I was like, this is the table, what you asked for. And she was like, oh, and she didn't mean that. And so it was just quite amusing because I was like, okay, like I really need to kind of double check with her. And, you know, she does that with me now, is double check what we've agreed to. Yeah, for
I
sure.
guess the other one that I've seen a little bit is, and again, I've seen this with people who don't have autism too, but where people get quite fixed on this is how I want to do this study. And then I think it's an interesting balance between how you sort of, what's the word? How you sort of respect and honor the fact that it's their PhD and that
Yeah,
this is what they want to do, and sort of understand the fact that there might be less cognitive flexibility in terms of looking at other options and seeing that different ways could work,
yeah,
versus your kind of supervisory responsibility
for sure.
sort of advice. Yeah, that might work, I'm not sure, but it's high risk, or it's not angled at the journal I thought we were going for, or I wonder if you had me, whether that's something you've experienced or seen.
Yes, yes. I think task switching is challenging for both, you know, those with autism who might have monotropic interests where they're focusing on one thing at a time, or with those who have HD, kind of this is what I want to do and that's what I'm doing right now, and this is my hyper focus. Don't you dare shift my attention. And so I think for sure, I think that has definitely come up with me and clients where you've set up, but this is my intention, this is the gap in the research, this is where I'm going, and this is what I'm doing, and I'm going to answer this question. But then whether it's miscommunication or new things come to light where there's a change is needed. And I've recently gone through one where I've gone from doing a systematic review to now including many more studies in my systematic review, so from 18 to now 41, to then being like, oh, let's do a meta-analysis, which will create much, you know, richer research, rich insights. However, it's kind of, for me personally, has been really hard because I dug everything, you know, dug deep and kind of really went down and got all the information and spent almost a year on the systematic review to then be like, actually, this isn't right. We need to change. And I think it's really difficult. And I think that's the first thing is I would, for any, you know, anyone who's listening, like it's as a student or whether you're a supervisor who's looking to help their supervisee, is thinking about acknowledging that it's difficult and acknowledging that change is hard. And it is down to the PhD student at the end of the day, like this is their choice and their PhD. However, you have a supervisor for a reason, right? You have a supervisor who has experience, who has guidance and can help you, hopefully to success, you know, to completing your doctorate. So that's something that has been important for me to remember is I don't know what I'm doing. The supervisor might not either, but it's really important to remember that as how challenging it is, you want to create your best work, and if that is the best work, then that's important to go on and do. And that's something with clients, it's having that conversation of, yes, it's difficult, and let's hash it out and let's get through it and talk about it, but what outcome do you want to have, and where do you want to be, and how do you get there? And don't get me wrong, that kind of wrestling and that, you know, changing topic and changing direction can bring up all sorts of emotions, like anger, fear, frustration, all sorts. Lots of procrastination because I don't want to start this new task, new topic. Yeah, and kind of strategies that I've kind of gone with is to say, okay, let's look at this kind of big ugly mess and how do we break it down? Like, what are the tasks, you know? Okay, first of all, read about meta-analysis, look at the couple of different kinds of meta-analysis, think about the different, you know, whether it's random effects or fixed effects, for example. And this is you going granular, and then breaking down like, okay, so let's look at all the studies. What kind of analysis did they do? But like breaking it down into steps. And I think that's something that both, I guess, someone who has ADHD and autism, for myself, I need to break things down into chunks, otherwise it feels massive and I can't get anywhere. So something that has helped me working with clients is saying, okay, with your supervisor, if you can, get a check-in point, even if it's 15 minutes every 2 weeks, have some goals, these breakdown steps, and check in. And that way you don't have to wait till the monthly or bi-monthly supervisor meeting where you haven't got to where you said you'd get because you were so overwhelmed. So it's realizing that, I guess, one size doesn't fit all when you're supervising. For students who are neurodivergent, they will need different things. But on the flip side, your students may be bounds and leaps ahead with the right guidance because they're like, oh yeah, no, I know what I'm doing now. Like I'm focused and I'm interested, and I can get loads more done than perhaps a neurotypical student might do. I think it's really important to remember that you're, as an autistic individual, you may have strengths that are way above and beyond a neurotypical person. There's such thing as called a spiky profile that you may have come across, where your executive function, your different skills, whether it's organization, memory, time management, you may have drops where it's maybe not so good, but then huge peaks where your skills outnumber the neurotypicals on your team. So you're very much looking like a spiky profile. And there's quite a few occupational psychologists who do a lot of work in that area around neurodiversity as well that I recommend looking into. There's Almuth, McDowell and Nancy Doyle, and many more names, but they focus a lot on kind of strengths-based coaching. What are the person's strengths? What are they really good at? Some clients, it might be attention to detail, so really researching to the nth degree on one area and knowing all about it and being able to tell the supervisor or teach a topic, whether it's a class, all about that specific area, and bring so much passion to the topic because they're so interested in it. But then also you're coming at something with a different angle, a different perspective, because your brain looks different. There are studies that show the brain looks different under an fMRI scan. So the different parts of the brain are, I don't want to say different again, but look visibly different. And so remembering that your brain works differently and often your perspective is different is a huge strength. So another strength that I've come across with clients I work with, but also within myself, is often those with autism have experienced an awful lot of difficulties, in which case they often have a deep level of empathy and understanding and can really relate to a lot of people in many different ways. And these are just things off the top of my head from my experience and my work, but you can find lots of different strengths of all the different neurodivergent types on National Institute of Care guidelines, or whether you want to look at the NHS. But then there's an awful lot of research papers that talk about the strengths of neurodivergent employees. For example, dyslexia, the British Dyslexia Association has massive on the strengths of both dyspraxia and dyslexia. But yeah, I could go on about those all day. But it's so important when you are working with students or your supervisees to think about, yes, the challenges, but what are their strengths? How can I encourage them and empower them to not feel, oh, just because I have a hidden disability or I'm neurodivergent, that I'm behind or I'm worse off than everyone else, which is not the case.
Quick interjection. If you're finding this episode helpful, but you're driving, walking the dog, or doing dishes, just remember this. When you're done, head to thePhDlifecoach.com and sign up for my newsletter. We've all listened to a podcast and thought, this is great, I should do something with it, and they didn't. That's why I created the newsletter, to help you actually apply the stuff that you hear. Each week, you'll get a short summary, some reflective questions, and one simple action that you can take right away. You'll also get access to a searchable archive of all the past episodes, so you can find the exact one that you need to help with your current challenges. Plus, all newsletter subscribers get a free webinar every single month on a topic that affects all PhD students and academics. And you will always be the first to hear for when my membership opens to new members. So once you're done listening, or even right now, go sign up for my newsletter and make sure you don't miss out. So important. And I think that notion of the spiky profile and thinking about both at the same time is really useful, because I've certainly seen with supervisors, and remember, and we'll talk about this later, listeners, supervisors might have autism too. This is not just about PhD students having autism, but certainly if you're a neurotypical supervisor and you have a neurodivergent student, sometimes it can be really confusing, right? Because you're like, Jess is brilliant. She knows her stuff so well. She's so on top of everything. I don't understand why she's having a freak out about talking at a research group meeting or whatever. She knows this stuff back to front, inside out. I can't shut her up about it in meetings. This makes no sense. I don't get it. And so I think really recognize, because if you don't understand that, it can be so confusing to understand why someone's having such strong emotions about something
Yeah.
that they're perfectly capable of because they're so good at that other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the kind of misconception of, especially from my experience, women who are late diagnosed, is that they've learned to mask and they've learned to manage all of this, and it gets to a point of burnout and significantly impaired daily functioning where women just basically can't manage anymore. And I think that's really important, is having that curiosity and that open communication to say, these are my strengths and these are the areas that I find difficult and this is what happens. And I think having a psychologically safe environment, even though it's an overused term, but somewhere where you can say, hey, this is really difficult, or this is causing me a lot of anxiety, and being real and honest, I think is super important to be able to acknowledge it and get it out in the open and move on. Because I think the supervisory role isn't always an easy one, because you're both, an academic and you're pushing the student further ahead, but then you're also acting in some sort of pastoral capacity, whether you have officially given that term or not, but you are meeting the student most regularly compared to anyone else, so you will see their kind of ups and downs. So it's really important to have that kind of open conversation, and that also then takes awareness of both the supervisor and the PhD student. I think that would be my recommendation, is reflecting a lot and thinking about what you want to share, but then explaining why, because I think the supervisor is not there to fix everything, because it's very much an independent journey, but they want you to do your best, so you're trying to helping them understand how you can get there.
I've done a few episodes recently where we've talked about mental health, we've talked about doing challenging research, we've talked about doing a PhD with chronic illness and other disabilities and that sort of thing. And in all of them, I try and find this balance between what can you do as an individual. So you've got something that's kind of a bit empowering, that I can grasp hold of this and change my own situation. Whilst also at the same time recognizing that you're not responsible for the environment, and that universities have a duty of care to support students with different needs. So I want to kind of talk with you about both of those. So let's start with the individual students. So if there's people listening, which I know there 100% are, so people in my audience who have autism themselves, both and academics, what can they be doing that can improve their own situations?
Yeah, that is a really great question. I think first and foremost, acknowledging that you are neurodivergent and you are not neurotypical, and getting rid of neurotypical expectations of yourself, knowing that you will not necessarily work 9 to 5. You will not sit down at your desk 9 to 5. You may do, but you most likely won't. And so it's not acknowledging that, some days you may have, this kind of idea of a spoon theory where, your maximum number of spoons might be 5, and some days it might just be 1 spoon. And this is really difficult to do. But acknowledging, today I have 1 spoon, so I'm going to do it one little bit. If I have 5 spoons, I'm going to crack on and maybe do a lot more. So first of all, neurotypical expectations, get rid of them. Secondly, I would be very careful about your environment, what is draining and what is, not draining is probably the better way of saying it. So if you're studying, or if you've kind of forced yourself to work in an area that is really draining, whether it's sensitivity to noise, to light, kind of comfort, the chair you're sitting on, your workspace, be really careful about where you put yourself, because as an autistic and female myself, I'm very sensitive to light, to noise, to my surroundings. I can't work if people are in the area and that they might be watching me work and they might not be. I don't do well in a shared office, in a shared environment. I don't get anything done because I'm too worried about how does my face appear? Do I look friendly? Do I look grumpy? Am I fiddling with my feet because I'm trying to concentrate? That's not socially acceptable. So finding an area where you can be comfortable, I think, is that you're in charge of that. And whether that is, in the floor of the library, or whether that's at home in your bedroom, or whether that's your kitchen table, that's something that a practical nature is useful. One other thing you can do is, and I know it can be tricky, but applying for disabled students allowance. So if you are diagnosed, you can then use that and get support, whether that's physical support, so in terms of a laptop or kind of software that can help you. It might be you're able to access coaching, or you're able to have a new desk and chair that's more comfortable, and that works on an annual basis, so you're able to get that each year as a student. And if you are a supervisor listening, you should be able to get access to work. So your access to work through the government enables you to, the government's hope is to stay in work and to keep you employed. Go check it out, because it is really useful, and it also works for those who are self-employed as well. You're able to get access to that.
And obviously, and again, just for listeners listening, this is kind of UK centric in the specific,
Yes,
but
apologies.
all good. But just to clarify that for
Mm.
my many listeners who are not in the UK,
Yeah.
most places will have similar versions of that.
Yes. Yeah. So that would be get someone to help you to sort that out if it's difficult for you to do. So I think, and the last one is probably being kind to yourself, because I kind of mentioned at the beginning. I think, especially if you have a late diagnosis or you're just starting academia again, it's watching what you say to yourself in your head, and which is very much easier said than done. But often it's thinking about, the shoulds. I should have, I could have, and you talk to yourself the most. So it's trying to be kind and look at what you have managed to achieve, having goals each week on things that you can try and meet. And realistic goals are really helpful when you have days that you're not achieving or you're not completing something, and due to maybe your energy levels. The last one would be just keeping an eye on yourself and looking after yourself. So it's easier said than done, of course, but eating well, trying to get as much sleep, rest, exercise, it's the usual. I took myself out for a short walk earlier today because I was stressed out and overwhelmed, and that really helped, getting out in the sunshine, seeing some nature. Yeah, I'm not great at it, but trying to put in these routines it does help as well.
Definitely. Here's something that I've always found difficult in both when I was supervising, but also now with clients sometimes as well. How do you find the balance between accepting things are the way they are, and there are some things that you're never going to change and do, versus the things that with support and development you could learn to do, if you see what I mean. I know whenever I'm not talking like we're going to develop away autism, and we wouldn't want to, that's not what I mean. But like, I see some students who have autism being quite like, I can't do any of those things.
Yeah.
Have autism, I can't do them. And I see others being a bit more like, okay, if you want me to do a presentation, I'm going to need this, this, and this in order to make that possible. And I need some padding either side of it to allow me to decompress and blah, blah, blah. Where do you find, especially, maybe I'm just thinking about it as a supervisor again, but where do you find that balance between encouraging somebody to consider ways they could be supported to try something versus not pushing them to do something that's not what their brain looked for want of a better?
I think it's a tricky one. My initial answer would be it really depends on the individual, and it depends on whether it's a matter of confidence and believing in themselves, or whether they will most likely have a meltdown or a shutdown as a result of that experience. And you've got to be really careful understanding the difference, I think. And it might be that they are able to build up small steps so that they then avoid a shutdown or avoid a meltdown, or it may be that that's not possible. And I guess it depends on the individual and what their goals are. I think, as students come to you for coaching, it's like, what are their goals, and finding realistic goals and where they want to get to, and what those small steps in between look like as kind of wins. And in terms of accepting, there may be some things that they may always get really tired in social environments that may never change, but it's, can we minimize which social environments they go to? Can they join lectures online? Can they get the support in terms of maybe more counselling from the university to talk through things, or kind of, like you said, like what buffering and what padding can be put in to help them? Or it may be that might not be something that they'll ever grow in, and that might stay. Just like someone who's maybe non-verbal may never be verbal, may always use, for example, Makaton or another sign language to express what they're saying. So it's very unique to the individual. It's not kind of a hard and fast rule. I think it's, as a supervisor, as a coach, it's thinking about, I guess, what is the goal for them, where they want to get to, and what maybe working together, what are achievable steps to get there, because only they will know themselves and what they're capable, and what they're really just saying, no, I can't do it, but actually they can.
And that's the difficult bit, isn't it? I think sometimes, especially if you're late diagnosed and you've spent time telling yourself you should be different and things, I think sometimes the person doesn't necessarily know which it is either. Because I can see it happening both ways around, right? That somebody, especially somebody late diagnosed, being like, no, I can learn how to do this, I can handle this, because they don't want to accept that they can't. But then on the other hand, people being quite fixed at no, I definitely can't, when actually it's sometimes, not always,
Yeah.
but sometimes the lack of confidence that you talked
Yeah.
about, actually with the
Yeah.
right support they could. And so I think that makes it kind of extra complicated, because it's not like the person with autism has this absolutely clear perspective
Yeah.
of exactly
Yes.
where their boundary sits with that either.
True. Yeah, that's true. I'm afraid I don't have a hard and fast rule with that. It is a unique and engaging on the person how much you can push them and encourage them. And you're very much saying it from a place of, I think you have this capacity. Can we try it together? And they might say no, or they might say, actually, no, Vicky, I'm going to take a chance. Let's try this. Or like 4 sessions later, they might say, actually, Vicky, I realise I said no to this, but actually, I think I might try it. And it might just be building that trust with you to find that they might try that again.
I really like this sort of figuring it out together, having that kind of, whether it's a supervisory relationship or a coaching relationship, or whatever, this sort of let's figure this out. Let's think about what that would look like. What might make that possible? One of the qualities, so I talk about being your own best boss quite a lot. And one of the qualities that we talk about a lot in that is curiosity alongside compassion. Curiosity coming from a compassionate perspective, but being like, oh, I wonder if this would help. Or I wonder if we'd be better off just saying we're not doing those things for a while. Or having that kind of thing of, let's figure things out. Let's be open and honest and see what we can do here.
Yeah. And I think you're quite right. It's a relationship, you know, it's a professional relationship, but it's still a relationship, and it's one where you can kind of explore things and think, okay, what is possible? You know, what happens if we try this? What, you know, hypothetically, what would that look like, or what would come up, or maybe where have you done this before?
So we sort of started there talking not only about what people can do for themselves, but also how supervisors can support students with autism. Let's build on that a little bit more. So how can anybody who is neurotypical in the university environment, so this whether you're a student or a supervisor, how can they support and make the most of working with people with autism?
Yeah, that's really great. And I think even the fact that the supervisors are asking, you know, how can I make the most of this? How can I empower or support my supervisee is the first step you really want. But I think what I would kind of initially say is, you know, if the university has any sort of neurodiversity awareness training, go to them, you know, learn. I think is the key thing, is to learn, you know, what it might look like. And then secondly, acknowledging that each person's experience and diagnosis looks different, or you know, that how they are neurodivergent looks different. So I'm autistic, but you know, you might meet somebody else who's also autistic, and we may come across differently. And I think the reason I'm saying is that it's important for supervisors to think about maybe starting like a how to work with me document. And that might look like, you know, preferred communication styles. So again, talking back to what we said before, like, shall we have an email chain, or shall we have an email with a summary, and then we have a Teams meeting, and maybe we have videos off or videos on? They have maybe transcription, if transcription's allowed, to kind of record what's being said, or allowing note takers into the meeting. So it's that kind of thing would be included in the how to work with me document. And then setting clear expectations as to, this is how often we'll meet, this is what we're going to be covering, this is my remit of what, you know, I don't want, maybe the supervisor doesn't want to talk about anything personal. They might not want to be asked, you know, what they got up to the weekend. That's okay. So those kind of, I guess, rules of engagement is maybe a nice way of putting it. And then also being prepared to continually reflect on what's working and what's not working as well, and trying to create a space where that can happen. And all this is best practice, and you know, in an ideal world, and it's understanding that supervisors are usually squashed into their other lecturer duties and head of whatever they're doing. So it's trying to create something that's simple and effective, rather than an extra burden of time and energy.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's really important to recognize that the environment in which people are supervising is not always easy. But I also think that, you know, this stuff should make everyone's life easier. In fact, so much of what you said today just really strikes me as just universal good practice, right? And I know that's kind of the principles of universal design and all that, that most of the things that are set out for people with disabilities or neurodivergences will benefit anybody. One that we haven't really talked about that I think is quite useful is thinking about sort of giving space for somebody to have an initial reaction. Because one of the things, especially we were talking about changing stuff before, one of the things that I've noticed, both in supervision and in coaching, is that sometimes somebody with autism will have quite a strong initial reaction to a change.
Yeah.
But that if you, as the person who's either suggested the change or that's supervising that situation or whatever, can manage your own emotions about their reaction and stay kind of calm and present, then often with some time, and the amount of time can vary hugely, right? Whether they need to go away and come back tomorrow, or whether it's a 5 minute, have a glass of water and go stretch your legs or whatever.
Yeah.
But learning to manage your own emotions in that moment and not feel apologetic or defensive or all of those things, and just kind of giving it space for a second, I think can then really allow that person to have their legitimate reaction, but then also afterwards to choose what their actual response is. I mean,
and I think that then comes back to the how to work with me document as to if there are changes, because in an ideal world, PhDs go to plan, everything follows step 1, step 2, step 3, there's chapters are written up, done. But 9 times out of 10 that's not the case, whether the data collected was incorrect or whether the systematic review turned into a systematic review and a meta-analysis. But I think it's then saying, okay, if changes are made, how would you like them communicated? Would you prefer them over an email and then we'll discuss in a meeting? Or would you prefer me to bring it up in a meeting at the end and then you can go and we can discuss it? And again, we're not going to be able to cover every eventuality in a how to work with me document, but acknowledging that part of being autistic is you may not cope with change, or you may not manage that in a neurotypical way. Just as if you're excited about something, you may impulsively say something that's great, or you may say something that wasn't very helpful, and you need to apologize. So I think it's acknowledging that impulsivity is part of an ADHD diagnosis, and that it's not someone just being rude or having lack of self-control, because it's a legitimate executive function. Like it's something that doesn't go so great always. So I think it's those things are important to consider.
And that's where I think, so I do supervisor training, not specifically on this area, that's way beyond my scope of practice, but general supervisor training. And one of the things that we talk about a lot in that is not projecting your own reasoning for behaviors onto other people's behavior. Because often if somebody is late for a deadline, say, if the supervisor is somebody who take deadlines very seriously, they assume that means Jess isn't taking this seriously, or whereas we know that regardless whether you've got ADHD, autism, or nothing at all, sometimes you miss deadlines even when you are taking it very seriously, right? And similarly, I think, like with the impulsive thing, sometimes somebody who's very neurotypical, quite reserved, all of those things might, well, I would only say that if I was being really rude and disliked the person. And so one of the things we spend quite a bit of time thinking about is how you can almost have that kind of flexibility to recognize that there's likely, especially if you know that they've got diagnoses, there's likely to be a bunch of reasons why they just said the thing that came
absolutely
off grumpy.
For sure.
And it's hard, right?
It is.
Even if you're neurotypical, you're tired and you're busy and all those things, it's hard to always do that. But even if you can do it in retrospect, where afterwards you're like, that might have been impulse rather than anything else or whatever, I think can really help.
And I think, as I said, I'm doing a PhD and I'm still learning, and I'm still, getting things wrong and apologizing or, saying things and being like, is anyone bothered by that? Like, I don't know. Should I send an email? Should I send a Teams message? Am I overthinking it? And this is where it's great if you have, a couple of supervisors and perhaps they all have maybe different roles or different strengths, that some might be more pastoral and some might be more academic, and maybe you have the opportunity to sense check with maybe the pastoral type supervisor, how did that go? What do you think? And, this is all an ideal world, but it can be quite nice when the team is a bit more blended. And even if, someone might not be necessarily that pastoral focused, you might have someone else in the team that can support. And it also, that added layer of complexity is if perhaps your supervisory team, someone is neurodivergent and maybe very different, in how you work. Or
very similar, right? this happens personality wise as well as neurodivergent wise, is there's obvious challenges. If you've got someone who's neurotypical and somebody who's got autism, for example, they may have misunderstandings. But I do think there is also, I have been personally in situations, not with PhD students, but with like undergrads and that sort of thing, where there's me and my enthusiastic, non-diagnosed ADHD self, and they've actually got ADHD, and every meeting is just like, oh, we could do this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So many ideas.
And if you haven't got awareness around that, and similarly, you could have two people who are autistic that are just absolutely fixed on this is how we're doing this, and then something comes along and no one's got the kind of capacity to be flexible about it. So I think it's not always when you're different. I think there's danger in similarities too sometimes.
And I think your supervisor training sounds really important, because I think from my understanding, a lot of supervisors, and this is just my experience, I don't think they have a lot of training, and I don't think that's provided. So it's very much they have to figure out as they go along. And, they want their PhD student to finish within the allotted frame of time, and they want them to meet the goals. There's a lot of pressure on them to help the student get there. So I think it's not the easiest role for them either. And I think often the student doesn't, if they've not been around the university setup, they may not know that or appreciate that. So it's another thing to bear in mind and say, this supervisor may only have 5 hours a month to actually support you, if that.
In my experience, most supervisory training focuses on procedures, right? It's like, what forms do you need to fill in, when, what are the requirements of you, what's the minimum rules of engagement, right? You have to meet once a month and blah, 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 all that stuff. Some universities do provide others. And as I say, I provide much more detailed supervision, which really gets into how your thoughts and emotions influence the way you supervise, and how expectations of supervision can be so different between different people, not just with neurodivergences, but also with people who come from different countries, who have different experiences with their own supervisor previously as to what they expect a supervisor would provide. I think it's a huge issue, and I think it's something that universities should really be investing a lot more in than they do.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, I can only speak for the clients that I've had and the clients I'm working with, but then also for myself, I'm a heterosexual white woman. I don't have that kind of intersectional lens. I'm not able to talk from that, and I think that's something that is also huge in understanding, and listening to autistic voices from an intersectional lens, whether that be gender identity or whether that is race. And that's something that I'm painfully aware of when I do my training, is there's only so much published research as well from those different intersectional lenses. So that's really important to think about and consider.
And probably, I assume, variations in diagnoses rates as well. I mean, you mentioned gender differences in diagnoses, but I would be amazed if there weren't differences in diagnosis rates amongst different ethnicities and races.
For sure.
There are with most things.
Mainly also due to stigma and kind of lack of understanding. And how it looks, maybe, as well. We're so far behind in that sense. And they've only just decided that you can be diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. I think it was like 2012 that was possible. And then to have a combined diagnosis, just there's so much progress still yet to be done.
And we obviously want to avoid, because I do think there is a tendency for people who have a kind of passing interest in this stuff to sort of notionally diagnose the people around, and I don't think that's helpful either.
No,
I'm a big believer that if you self-identify as having any of these things, then I'm down, because if you identify symptoms,
yourself.
There's a lot of barriers to getting officially diagnosed, but
for sure,
different to diagnosing someone else. But one of the questions that I encourage people to think about is, how would I behave if I knew they were autistic, for example, and asking yourself, are there ways you can just do that now anyway? I would give them really clear instructions after a meeting, and I would make sure I pre-warned them if there was something coming up that might be surprising. You could just do that
for everybody
without ever mentioning the A word.
Oh, definitely.
Never telling them your suspicions, but instead of just assuming that they're stubborn or whatever, just do those things. And
and I had that with a client the other week. I had people coming up to me after the training. I did all during one of the breaks, and their question was, what do I do if they're not diagnosed, or I suspect they are? What do I do? And I'm like, if you're managing someone, you will understand what the strengths and challenges of all your employees and who you're working with, and then you will help them play to those strengths and support them in their challenges. So how to work with me guide, and I keep talking about it, but it is just what works for that person, and it doesn't matter if they have a diagnosis or not, because from a practical everyday working style, not necessarily from a legal standing, but it's so important to treat someone as an individual. And if you're not doing that already, start doing it, because your team will all work differently regardless of whether they're neurodivergent or not. So it's, you get to know your team, and like you said, if you think that they may be that way, ask and just say, don't say, are you autistic? Say, how does that work for you? Like, do you enjoy that kind of setup? Does this space work for you? Just from a curiosity, decent human being perspective. It's not always rocket science, and I think people can be really worried that they have to give someone a diagnosis before they can start asking questions, but it's how you ask the question, and it's what kind of questions you're asking, in terms of, I noticed that you were quite quiet in the last meeting. I want to make sure all employees' voices are heard. If you've got any thoughts, feel free to send me an email with them. And you're not singling someone out in terms of you think they're autistic, but you're just kind of asking them, how did that go? Yeah.
So you've started touching on this already, but what can people do at a sort of institution level to make things more inclusive for neurodivergences?
Yeah, so I think a lot of organizations already have like an equality policy, so a DEI policy, and in those policies they include disability, but they don't explicitly talk about hidden disabilities, so neurodiversity. To start with, having a visible neurodiversity policy on their website, on their job spec, saying we support an inclusive and neuro-inclusive environment, doing training on how to be inclusive in recruitment, how to support managers, to train them as to how to work with neurodivergent employees. What would be wonderful would be mapping the workplaces or the campus, what areas are quiet, designated space, just like we often have a prayer space. Are there quiet spaces for neurodivergent employees or students? The canteens are an absolute nightmare for me. The lighting is a nightmare for me personally. For many people that I speak to, they can't stand just the space. Very sensitive, it's very draining. For many people I work with, they often have like a watch, like a Garmin or something, and they have a body battery or some sort of thing, where if they're on campus, it goes from maybe 90 down to 5, and it's all of those things that are intangible that really affect. So having some sort of sensory map as to say, these are the areas that are high traffic, these are the areas that are quiet, even if it's color coded, would be useful. And allocating space. What else? Training everyone from people at reception. There's a lot of sunflower lanyards floating about on campuses now, which is great, but what does that actually mean? How can you support employees or students, down to maybe the catering teams, to the academic staff, to the support staff, to the librarians, helping everyone understand what that might look like, and do regular ones and mandatory. I think a lot of this kind of stuff, unfortunately, is optional, but you have 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 are neurodivergent. The stats are there, the NHS England and NICE guidelines is there. Whether they realise they're neurodivergent or not, or whether they're disclosing they're neurodivergent or not, they need support. I think it's from if you talk about the life cycle of an employee, it's starting right at recruitment and kind of advertising, using clear, simple language in the job description, not having must be a self-starter, must be, all these kind of lingo that might not necessarily be relevant to the job role. They're just copied and pasted it on from a previous job role, and that will discourage people from applying. All the way through to, okay, now you're managing someone, you've never managed someone who's neurodivergent before. What's available to A, the manager, and to B, the employee, and how can you support them? Can you encourage them to apply for access to work? What is that? Help the employee understand. Start having a conversation as to what reasonable adjustments can we make. That should have also been discussed in that kind of initial period as to what kind of things might they need, and that's a conversation with HR. The first step is awareness and training, and then after that it's digging deep into kind of strategy and policy to really integrate it across the organisation.
It really resonates with my episode a few weeks ago where I was talking to Christina Francois about doing PhD with physical disabilities and illnesses. And one of the things that she was really talking about is how it's exhausting and often very difficult to have to suggest your own accommodations, because especially, so she has illnesses and conditions that have come on over the last year or two. It's not something she's always lived with or anything like that. And they're like, what do you need? And she's like, I don't know. What can I have? And that strikes me as quite similar to some of the stuff you're saying here, that having almost packages of, if you're running a conference, you need to do these things for your neurodivergent members. If you're running a module, you need to do these things. If you've got a PhD student, these are the options that you could put out like a buffet for them to choose what might be useful or whatever.
For sure. And I think what works for some neurodivergent students might not work for others. So for example, if you're dyslexic, using dyslexic fonts or installing a Chrome extension that makes everything into a dyslexic font that's readable, using apps that can make your screen a yellow color and providing high contrast that helps you to see better and read better. But all of these things, it's providing that kind of the training and documentation to help supervisors and lecturers and also students know that exists. A lot of this stuff is free. Inclusive teaching is a huge area that I looked at when I did my fellowship to higher education. How can we be more accessible and inclusive? And I think COVID was although a horrible experience, it meant that a lot of lectures had to be done online and a lot of things were recorded. And I did my master's during that time, and that was brilliant for me because as someone with ADHD, I was able to get up and walk around and move about whilst listening. I was able to pause things, go back over things. I think it's knowing that different approaches work with the different students.
Perfect. Now, if people have been interested, engaged, inspired, all of those good things by the stuff you said today, as I'm sure they will be, where can people follow you and find out more?
Sure. So I'm quite active on LinkedIn. So you can first head over there and drop me a message, or you can follow our company page. We also have a website, NeuroNatives.com. Feel free to contact us there with any inquiries, whether you want coaching, whether you want training and awareness sessions, or whether you want something more tailored. We can do whatever you need. I'm afraid I don't have Instagram, don't have Facebook, too distracting. So you'll find me on LinkedIn and also our website. Yeah.
Perfect. And I will put links to your LinkedIn in the show notes and to your website. Thank you, Jess, so much for today. That is super, super important. And it was wonderful having you here.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk through all of these things, and I hope it's been useful for the audience. And it's lovely chatting to you as well.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the PhD Life Coach podcast. If you like this episode, please tell your friends, your colleagues, and your universities. I'd appreciate it if you took the time to leave a review, give me stars, stickers, and all that general approval as well. If you'd like to find out more about working with me, either for yourself or for people at your university, please check out my website at thephdlifecoach.com. You can also sign up to hear more about my free group coaching sessions for PhD students and academics. See you next time.